Hey everyone, in this video we are going to do a guided walkthrough of the second type of free response question, which is free response questions that are addressing the topic of class. These free response questions will typically ask you to write your own class from scratch. They're basically going to outline what the class should do, the functionality of the class, and it's up to you to design a class that meets those specifications. So before we jump into this question, a couple of important things to consider when you're answering a free response question about classes. So what I'm going to outline here are just three topics that you should already be familiar with, but that are almost guaranteed to come up when you start to think about designing a class. So the first topic is fields, right? Fields are going to be the pieces of information that your class needs to hold. These are the private variables that are going to be declared in your class, and they're the pieces of information that are going to be initialized, and they provide the details of each instance of that class. The second thing you're going to want to think about are the constructors. Constructors, remember, are the methods that define how we create an instance of our class, and these constructors often are informed by the instructions that the free response question gives us. Right? So let's say we were making, for example, a circle class, and the problem said you need to be able to create circles by passing in a radius, or by passing in a circumference, or by passing in to an x and y coordinate. Well, we need to write constructors that allow us to pass in those different types of information and then create the circle or initialize the fields based on those inputs. The third thing you're going to need to write within your classes are going to be methods. And with methods, you're going to want to think about what modifiers go with these methods. So are they going to be public methods? Are any of them static methods? Most of that information will be given to you in the problem, but sometimes part of the challenge of one of these free response questions is figuring out for each method, what are the modifiers that go along with that method header, and what are the parameters that are passed into that method, and what are the return values, or what's the return type that might come out of that method. So getting each of those components right when you're defining methods can earn you points on a free response question, right? Remember that everything you do when you're writing a free response question response will earn you points. If you get it right, it will earn you points. So there's nothing to be lost by writing down everything that you know. And so again, I want to reiterate that if you know that there are going to be fields, there are going to be constructors, and there are going to be methods, you're already halfway there. Because if you can write fields, if you can write constructors, if you can write methods, even if your constructors, methods, and fields don't match perfectly what they were asking you to do, just the fact that you attempted to write them and you demonstrated that you know that a class has these three different things, that can earn you some points. Okay, so now let's dig into the particular question we're going to go over in this video. This question is called activity log. Activity log is a class. This is the class that you need to write. And the awesome thing about classes in Java is that classes represent real-world ideas or real-world objects. So before you ever jump into actually writing the code, you want to try to wrap your head around, what is this class supposed to do? What is it supposed to mimic? So the activity log class is intended to track the minutes of physical activity a person does. Okay? So it's kind of like one of those fitness trackers or, an exercise log, but this is basically the software that would go behind an activity log. And you're going to write it in the form of a class. So right off the bat, you can kind of start to think about what you might want in this activity log, right? You're going to want a field that keeps track of the minutes of physical activity. You're going to want a method that can return that value, right? A getter that returns back how many minutes a person has done. You're probably going to want a method that adds on minutes, so updates the number of minutes every time the person does a physical activity, right? So already you can kind of start to brainstorm and think about what the activity log class might contain before we've even jumped into the full description of this problem. Okay, so I would encourage you to take a minute now to brainstorm for yourself what you think might go into this activity log, and then in the next video, we're going to dig into reading the question and examining the problem in more detail. All right, folks, in this video, we're going to dig into the full description of the activity log class and talk a little bit about how you might outline the fields, constructors, and methods for this challenge. So This question involves the implementation of an activity log class, which is intended to track the minutes of physical activity a person does. Okay, we know that. The activity class supports, this is actually activity log class supports adding high and low intensity activities, calculating a weighted total number of active minutes, and reporting the longest activity / high intensity activity. Okay, so that was a little confusing and a lot to take in, but we have to sort of expect that this is going to be explained further a little bit later in this description. So I'll go back to that sentence one more time, but don't get too hung up on this. The activity, and this is a typo here, this should be activity log class supports adding high and low intensity activities. Okay, so we're allowed to add high or low intensity activities. Calculating a weighted total number of active minutes. Okay, so that is another method we're going to need, which is calculating a weighted total number of active minutes, and reporting the longest activity / high intensity activity. Okay, so reporting the longest activity / high intensity activity, again, that's going to be another method, but it also indicates to me that we're going to need a field to keep track of what is the current longest activity. What is the longest activity that the person has logged so far? All right, so now let's scroll down a little further to get more of the description here. The activity log class provides the following methods. Log, which logs an activity of length equal to the number of minutes given by the first parameter, which is an int, and if the second parameter, Boolean, is true, this is a high intensity activity. Otherwise, it is a low intensity activity. Okay, so I know this is going to be a method. Sounds like it doesn't return anything. And I know that it takes into, as parameters, it takes an int as the first parameter, which is the number of minutes, and a Boolean, which is the second parameter that indicates whether we're logging a high intensity activity or a low intensity activity. Okay, next up we have active minutes. Returns the weighted number of active minutes calculated by the sum of all high intensity activities multiplied by 2, okay, plus the sum of all low intensity activities as an int. Okay. So this method returns the weighted number of active minutes calculated by the sum of all high intensity activities multiplied by 2. Okay, so this is another indication to me that I'm going to need to keep track of in a field the sum of all high intensity activities so that later I can multiply it by 2. And I need to keep track of the low intensity activities as an int. So this is indicating to me that I now have 3 fields that I need to remember. One of them is the sum is the sum of all high intensity activities. One is the sum of all low intensity activities. And one is a field that keeps track of the longest activity that we've done thus far. And I'm thinking that I'm actually going to need to keep track of the longest activity and the longest high intensity activity. All right, the last one here is longest returns the longest single activity overall if the parameter is false. Okay, so longest is going to have a parameter that is a Boolean. And if the parameter is true, it returns the longest high intensity activity. Okay, so here again, I'm remembering that I'm going to need to keep track of the longest single activity and the longest high intensity activity. And then it returns these values as ints. Okay, so I forgot to diagram out this active minutes. So remember, active minutes now, we know that it returns an int and the input is nothing. Okay, so there's no input, there's no parameters, it just returns an int. And then longest here is going to return an int as well, but this one actually has a parameter, which is a Boolean. All right, so then I can even go down here a little bit further, and I can see the following table contains sample code, execution sequence, and corresponding results. All right, so statements and expressions. Here I'm actually creating an activity log called A, which equals new activity log. Now you'll notice here, this is an empty constructor, or a default constructor with no parameters. So that's nice to know that I can actually construct an activity log without any parameters, which means that the default constructor is going to be okay. I don't actually need to pass any, I don't actually need to create a constructor for this class. Then a.activeMinutes. Okay, I'm getting that there are 0 active minutes so far. A.longest false, there are no activities, so that's 0. And longest, this would be longest true, right? So if longest is true, then if the parameter is true, return the longest high intensity activity. But again, since we haven't logged anything yet, we have 0. All right, so then here we're logging a 45-minute low intensity, 30-minute low intensity, 20-minute high intensity, and then I can check my active minutes, and you see that it's the total of all these activities. Okay, so active minutes needs to be keeping track of the total. But again, I can't forget that this high intensity activity is weighted. So it's going to be 20 times 2 plus 75 for my low intensity minutes, and that adds up to 115. Then down here, if I do longest false, it tells me 45 because that's the longest low intensity activity. And then longest true gives me 20 because that's the longest high intensity. All right, then here I can log another 50 minutes of high intensity, 30 minutes of low intensity. Our active minutes is updated, and our longest activities have now updated again. All right, so that was that was kind of a lot of me talking. So I'm gonna now take a break here and give you a chance to read through this on your own. And then in the next video, we're gonna take a stab at actually coding this up together. Hey folks, in this video, we're going to look at coding the solution to the activity log free response question. So with this type of problem on the AP test, you're actually going to be given the frame for your class. It should have set up for you public class activity log. But then what's between these two curly brackets is going to be blank. And this is where you, as the software designer, are expected to fill in all of the fields, constructors if necessary, and methods of this class. So if we remember from reading our problem description, we're going to want a few different variables or a few different fields to keep track of information in our activity log. So for one, remember we needed to keep track of the number of active minutes that a person has been doing activity. So this is like the total number of active minutes that a person has been exercising. This is going to be updated each time that a person logs a new activity. And we'll talk about how to log active minutes, because remember, we're going to have to weight our different types of high intensity or low intensity activities. We will talk about how to weight those differently when we're adding on to our active minutes. But for now, we just know that we're going to need to keep track of active minutes. Next, we're going to want to keep track of the longest high intensity activity that we've done so far, as well as the longest low intensity activity we've done so far. Okay, so those are the 3 fields that we're going to need for this class, and you may have not come up with them right off the bat when you were starting to keep track of your information. And it's important to actually note that it is possible to use 2 different variables and keep track of active low and active high, and then do your weighting in a separate method. We could talk about another way to do that. That is possible, and you may see that as a different solution. But for now, for the solution that I'm going to present, we're going to keep track of just the active minutes, and we will update that with our log method and do the weighting of activities inside of that method where we log each new activity. All right, so then we know that we're going to need the methods that were defined for us in our problem statement. And I wanted to talk for a second about constructors. I mentioned in the previous video that when you looked at the default constructor or the example code, you saw a default constructor being used. And you may remember from the lesson on constructors that every class in Java has a default constructor built in, so we don't need to write the default constructor here. If we don't write a constructor for this class, then Java will include a default constructor for us. And what that default constructor will do is it will initialize each one of these fields to its default value, which for ints is going to be 0, which is perfect for us, right? Because we actually want each one of these numbers to start at 0. And so in this case, for this problem, we don't actually have to write a constructor. You could, if you wanted to, write a constructor that has no parameters and just is totally blank. Or you could say, set your fields to 0. But all of this is kind of redundant because Java's going to do it for us anyway. So I'm just going to leave this out. All right. So now we need to include our methods. And remember, I kind of like to comment in what I'm going to do before I actually do it. so I can remember and kind of plan ahead. So as I'm reading through the question, I'm going to remember that I need a log method. I need a method for keeping track of or returning the longest activity that we've done so far. And then I also need a method that returns the active minutes. So these are the three methods that I have to write according to the problem. And so log, if I remember from reading the question, because each one of these is in a method that's included in the class and we're going to have to create an activity log to use them, it means that none of those methods are static, right? So each one is going to be an instance method. So I'm going to say public, and then does log return any information? No, right? Log is just used for adding in new activities. So I'm going to say public void, the name of the method is log, and the parameters that I pass in, remember, are the number of minutes that the activity lasted, and then a Boolean, which says whether this is a high intensity activity or not. So if it is true, then this is a high intensity activity. And if it's false, it's a low intensity activity. All right, so that's my setup for the log method. And I'm going to leave that for now. I'm going to jump down to longest here. And let's see. Longest is going to return something, right? It's going to return an int because it's returning the longest activity that we have logged thus far. And then for the parameter that we pass in here, we're actually passing in another Boolean to indicate whether we want the longest activity that we have or we want the longest high intensity activity. So this is sort of an interesting one because it's not just saying whether we're returning the longest low intensity activity or the longest high. It's not just longest high or longest low. It's actually longest overall or longest high. So I could save these in two different parameters, but I'm actually going to use logic here to control that. And then that way I can just keep track of longest low and longest high in separate fields. Again, this is a design decision. You could have stored longest overall and then longest high just to see if they were different, but I will show you how to use logic here to actually achieve this, our functionality. All right, last up we have active minutes. And again, because I'm storing active minutes here, it's going to be pretty straightforward. Public int active minutes, excuse me. It has no parameters, and it's going to return act minutes. All right, so that's our outline here, and I have now the setup for log, longest, and active minutes. I've got my fields written in here. I'm going to stop here, and then we will come back in the next video to write out the logic for each of these methods. All right, folks, we are back with part 2 of coding the activity log free response question. So again, I'm going to write some comments here to help us illustrate what we're trying to do in each of these methods before I actually write the code. All right, so remember, in the log method, we're adding in some minutes. We're basically logging an activity that's either a high intensity activity or a low intensity activity. So the first one is going to be the logic we use for high intensity. And then the second one is going to be the logic we use for low intensity. And then if we remember, for high intensity, we add on minutes times 2 to active minutes. And then the other thing I want to do is update longest high, right? So if it happens that this activity turns out to be the longest high intensity activity I've done, then I want to update my longest high field. Otherwise, I'll just leave it as is. And then here we're going to add on minutes to active minutes and update longest low. Okay, so those are kind of the steps that I'm going to try to accomplish. And now I need to come up with the logic to actually do this. All right, so first, I want to know if this is a high intensity activity. And the way to do that is to just check if our Boolean is true. So if the Boolean is true, then we know that we're inputting a high intensity activity. And so I'm going to update act minutes, set it equal or add on 2 times the number of minutes we passed in. And then here is where I'm going to decide whether or not to update longest high. And I'm going to say if minutes is greater than longest high, right? So if we have an activity, if this is longer than our longest activity thus far, Then I'm going to set longest high equal to minutes. Okay? Then I'm basically going to write this same logic, but for if it's not a high intensity activity. So for the low intensity, and I'll go ahead and delete this because I kind of have a good idea of how I'm going to do this now. Else active minutes plus equals minutes, and then if minutes is greater than longest low, then I'm going to say, okay, longest low equals minutes. All right, I want to add some spaces after my if statements here just to clean this up a little bit to make sure our formatting is consistent. And I want to remove some of these spaces here. Now this is all kind of nice stuff to have, but when you're writing this on paper, you may not have time to do that. That's okay. I just like to make it nice and readable so you can, follow along in the video. All right, and then because this is a void method, I don't have to return anything. As long as I've updated act minutes and longest high or act minutes and longest low appropriately, then this method is done. All right, so now we're going to move down to longest. Okay, so the logic here can be a little tricky. So I want to just make sure I run through this in my head and write it in language so I can then turn it into code. All right, so the idea here is if high only, then return longest high. Okay. If not high only, but longest high is greater than longest low, then I'm going to return longest high as well. Okay. Else return longest low. All right, so let's walk through this again. So the idea is that if we passed in this Boolean and we said, okay, we only want to check the high intensity activities, then we're definitely going to return longest high because that's our longest high intensity activity. But if this is false, then what they really want is just the longest activity overall. And that could be the longest high or the longest low. And so in that case, if this is not true, but the longest high was greater than the longest low, then I still want to return longest high. And then finally, if I didn't return either of those things, then I can know that they actually wanted the longest low because this is the longest activity overall, and I'll return this value. Okay, let's write this out in code, and maybe for some of you that might actually make more sense. So I'm going to say, okay, so if high only, right? And then here we're going to be a little fancy, and we could have written this in two if statements, but we can combine these two statements, if high only, and the other condition was or longest high is greater than longest low, right? Because both of those cases indicate that we should be returning longest high. Else return longest low. The truth is that I can make this even a little bit more efficient, or I didn't actually have to write out this else statement. Sometimes for my thinking process, it's a little bit easier for me to understand if I think about, okay, this is one condition, and then if this isn't true, then this is going to be my other condition. But you don't actually need this else because the return statement sort of acts like an else. And what I mean by that is that if this were true, then we're going to return longest high and the method will be done. It'll end this function. If this wasn't true, then we'll get down to the next step and we'll return the longest low. So this is actually enough for us to accomplish exactly what we need to do for longest. Okay, and those are the three methods and the fields that you'll need to complete the activity log class. You may have come up with a different solution. Feel free to test it or review it with a neighbor, because there are lots of different ways to solve this problem, but this was just one that I thought was pretty straightforward and would demonstrate what is required for the activity log class. In our next video, we're going to look at the scoring of the activity log free response question. At this point, you should have written your full solution to the guessing game free response question. Now we're going to walk through the scoring together so you can figure out and evaluate your own solution. right? The goal here is to determine if you accomplished each of the scoring criteria, then award yourself that point, and then at the end, add up those points, and that'll be your score out of 9. All right, first scoring criteria is correctly declares the header for the guessing game class and declares appropriate class variables. So you'll earn this point. Really, this is about 2 things. 1, did you declare all instance variables as private? And 2, did you declare variables that would allow you to do and store everything you need to remember? In this case, the 3 things you need to remember are a target number, the number of guesses, and some indication of whether or not the game is over. The second scoring criteria is correctly declares the constructor header, right? So you had to declare a constructor, and hopefully you've had enough practice doing this that you made sure that you declared it as public, no return value, the name has to exactly match guessing game, and then you also need to declare the constructor with a single int parameter, that one int which is going to be the maximum of your random range. All right. Number 3, correctly sets initial values in the constructor, right? Did you correctly set the target to a random number between 1 and the parameter value, inclusive? So this is using math.random properly. Did you set your target equal to a random number between 1 and the parameter value inclusive, and was it an int? The second thing is, did you set the number of guesses to 0 and indicate that the game is not over? Some of this can be implicitly left at the default values if appropriate, right? Because the default value of an int is actually 0 and the default value of a Boolean is going to be false. So you could leave those as defaults and that would have given you the appropriate values. It's just important to note or to make sure that you didn't set them to something that's not 0 or true. All right, next up, did you correctly declare the header for the guess answer method? All right, guess answer method should be public, should have a string return type, right? Remember, it's returning a string. And it should have a single int parameter. The input is the guess. They also want to make sure you didn't use any additional incorrect modifiers, such as static. Next up, the guess answer method implements the correct behavior when the game is not yet over and an incorrect number is guessed. All right, so this is the first half of the guess answer method, which is, do you correctly tell the person, return too high, too low, when their guess is either above or below the target number? Did you also increment the number of guesses in your instance variable? And make sure you don't change the variable that indicates whether the game is over if they didn't get it correct. The second half of the guess answer method is, did you implement the correct behavior when the game is not yet over and the correct number is guessed? I guess this is sort of 2/3 of the answer, which is, did you, when they guess the correct number, are you returning correct as a string? Are you incrementing the number of guesses one more time? And are you changing the appropriate variable? This is the Boolean, which indicates whether the game is over. Point number 7 is the guess answer method when the game is already over, right? So this is the logic that controls what happens when the person tries to make another guess, but the game is already over. And in this case, did you return game already over when they try to take a guess? And do you not increment the number of guesses or change the appropriate variable indicating whether the game is over in this case? Okay, so that's the third part of the guess answer method behavior. All right, point number 8, the num guesses method is correctly declared and returns the number of guesses appropriately. This is pretty straightforward. Did you declare it as a public method that returns an int and it doesn't have any inputs and it returns the number of guesses that is stored in your instance variable, your member variable? And then finally, this is the last point for none of your code causes undesirable side effects. Again, no print statements, no incorrect constructors, no changing instance variables when you shouldn't. Okay, so those are the 9 points that you can earn for the guessing game method. Hopefully you earned all 9 of them. And if you didn't earn them, then now would be a good time to go back and check those parts of your solution to see what you could have done, and you can have a look at the solution provided to you, the canonical solution that your instructor will have that will indicate how you could have solved this problem.